Hello, everyone. This is Jim Kitsis, and I'm pleased to contribute a commentary for Criterion's DVD release of Stagecoach, a great film and a landmark in the history of the Western and the careers of John Ford and John Wayne. Many fans and scholars of Ford undervalue this film, suggesting it lacks the depth and complexity of later masterpieces. But I want to challenge that view. Stagecoach is a classic not only because it crystallized and refreshed the language of the genre at a key moment, but also because it still speaks eloquently to us today. Ford was hitting his prime, obvious in the freedom of the film's invention. He was returning to the Western after a 13-year absence during which it had fallen from favor, but he believed the two most beautiful things the camera could record are a couple dancing and a horse running. There are no waltzes here, but there will be horses galore. The director's respect for these magnificent animals is apparent as he holds on them in deep focus, galloping toward us, not once but twice, the dynamism of the shots growing as the space between us diminishes. With vigorous direction, Ford choreographs the second pair's arrival with the bugle's call and the raising of the flag, an appropriate salute at the outset of a film whose theme is the birth of a nation. Stand here, Chief, and look into the camera. We want to let 'em see at least one real Indian up close. I can just hear Ford directing Chief John Bigtree, arguably the most famous of all Native American actors. Apart from this visual aid of a Seneca playing a Cheyenne, to evoke the Apache, what Ford stresses is a name heard 3 times.
Geronimo.
Working in the silent era, Ford had learned movies had to move. No director is better at bringing a prairie town to life. And again, it is all horses in action, textbook Ford, the camera moving and cutting invisibly in time with movement in the frame. A pony, swept up in the wake of the stage, captures the spontaneous life of Ford's street. A veteran performer who had worked for Ford in the silent era and in 1933's Dr. Bull, squeaky-voiced Andy Devine was valuable, both for his comedy and his iconic Western persona. As Buck, the driver of our vehicle, he appropriately enters first, typically rattling on, with no one listening.
Well, sir, we run into a little snow up there. It weren't bad, though, but you fellas better prepare for a good frost.
But setting the stage for class warfare, Stagecoach will present its highborn passengers first. Louise Platt as haughty Lucy Mallory was perfect. The casting of an actress from Broadway opposite Dallas's Claire Trevor, veteran of hard-boiled B-movie roles, immediately created an appropriate emotional dynamic. The strength of the script that Ford and his writer Dudley Nichols developed was the rich mix of its characters and the way they fell into a pattern of allies and foes, typically as couples.
He's there with his troops.
He's a lot nearer than that, Mrs. Mallory. He's been ordered to drive forth.
Lucy moves through space as if she owns it, but John Carradine's character invades it, hinting at the alliance that will emerge. His frank appraisal of her through a signature window shot of Ford's, plus her glance back, introduces the important motif of seeing. Employing silent film conventions, much of Stagecoach's drama will develop through meaningful gazes and glances, looking and staring. At the sheriff's office, Buck and veteran character actor George Bancroft's Curly lay the foundation for the film's revenge theme and the entrance to come of the Ringo Kid, and form another couple who will command the coach.
Their testimony sent him to the penitentiary.
However, next we will meet a final elitist type who will remain at odds with everyone, the pompous Gatewood, played with relish by Burton Churchill, a Ford regular. A loose cannon, blowhard Gatewood is uniquely isolated. Although he gravitates to the aristocratic pair, they keep their distance, as does everyone else. The pro-business sentiments the banker repeatedly expresses would have won him no friends, either within the coach or with the period's audiences recovering from the Depression. In the late 1930s, Ford and Nichols were active on behalf of liberal and popular front causes, such as the anti-Franco Lincoln Brigade, and the film can clearly be read as their attack on establishment class values.
Sir, there's your receipt, $50,000. And remember this, what's good for the banks is good for the country.
In glaring contrast to Mallory's genteel welcome on Tonto Street, Ford's camera relentlessly tracks the humiliating exit of Dallas, the string of vertical posts she seems to be buffeted by in her forced march, suggesting the violence being inflicted. The theme of an abusive social prejudice is immediately doubled with the banishment of Thomas Mitchell's histrionic Doc Boone, who comes on stage in character, drunkenly showing off his classical education. He will immediately form an alliance with the sad Dallas to balance that of Mallory and Hatfield. Heavyweights, Mitchell and Carradine at Hammy's stretch made a great match of classic fallen types. Mitchell was fresh from Ford's The Hurricane, and his heroic drunk here would win him the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. Carradine had begun with Ford in 1936's The Prisoner of Shark Island and would appear in 10 Fords in all, most famously, Grapes of Wrath. Doctors in Westerns are often alcoholics, a sign that Eastern erudition is no guarantee of superiority to cowboys, and that medicine can exact heavy costs to those who carry its responsibilities. With an air of defeat about him, Hatfield seems to embody the South itself, hungover from the disastrous war these two have different names for. They form another couple, albeit not one of allies. Boone's final saloon visit is framed by the director in a trademark shot, filming from inside through a dark doorway to the bright street beyond. Such setups can be found as far back as in Ford's Straight Shooting of 1917. But the shot of the nearly empty bar, with its window through which a horse seems to peek, and that provides the image with depth and morning light, is itself a thing of beauty, typical of the quiet visual pleasure Ford's films offer. The bartender here is an old buddy of the director's, Jack Pennick, whose flattened face is a fixture in countless Fords, one of the many members of his personal stock company. In a scene that vibrates with irony, our nervous whiskey drummer meets his nemesis in the rummy Boone, to whom he will be joined at the hip for the duration. Although some readings have located him amongst the so-called respectable, his lowly position as a salesman of booze, plus his meekness, logically place him with the downtrodden.
My name is Peacock.
He's a whiskey drummer.
What?
The film itself had ignored him on his arrival. Played by veteran character actor Donald Meek, how's that for typecasting? He is the perfect foil to Gatewood, the two vivid contrasts in manner and physique, icons of timidity and bluster. But having introduced players, Ford now typically insists we also take note of the team of 6 horses that will provide the horsepower that drives the coach and that will save the party in the race with Indian ponies at the end. By 1939, Ford had over 20 years of directing behind him, including the silent era's Harry Carey series and the epic The Iron Horse, and some 25 sound features crowned by the long-shot triumph, 1933's The Informer. That he was a top director at full stretch in Stagecoach is demonstrated by its tour de force opening. From the arrival of the vehicle in Tonto, the narrative develops with an elegant logic, a movement that is lateral and circular, everything flowing from and then back to the coach. Stretching her limbs, Mallory led us to Hatfield, who, although not formally introduced, had imposed himself. Buck led us to Curly, who in turn focused our attention on Ringo, albeit in absentia. This chain of logic continues with the money delivered from the stage to Gatewood, at which point the elegance of the structure culminates in a pirouette of reverse logic as we cut from the pillar of society to its dregs. Further movement is now toward the coach, from Dallas to Doc Boone, and from the town drunk naturally to the liquor salesman. At this point, the circle is all but closed. This is partly accomplished by Mallory's return to the coach with her pals, whose shock that she will share space with Dallas prompt her to curiously inspect the whore.
She's right, Lucy. And besides, you're not well enough to travel.
A medium shot of the trio will allow their finery to register, and perhaps especially the loose wraps of Mallory's formal costume. However, traveling alone on the frontier isn't for a gentlewoman. With Mallory will come Hatfield in a defining, flamboyant entrance. Ford tightens the link between them with a perfect match of balancing close-ups of each studying the other, the first of a number of turning points where key characters share meaningful looks. With the completion of the circle, the narrative will shift to a single-minded, straight-ahead movement and remain spatially attached to the coach until journey's end. A marvel of economy, the opening introduces all the principals thus far in character and provides a tour of Tonto. Ford always has it both ways with his communities, suggesting they are primitive and imperiled, but also the site of Shakespeare and fancy balls. Tonto is a case in point. It is right on the frontier, in the vicinity of Indian savagery, Hatfield's jungle. Yet it is also like an eastern town, if anything over-civilized, with its narrow-minded citizenry. The cavalry officer is Tim Holt, whose father, Jack, worked with Ford on silent westerns. Just 20 here, he would star for Orson Welles in 1942's The Magnificent Ambersons, and Ford would use him as Virgil Earp in My Darling Clementine in 1946.
Soldier boys.
I have my orders, sir, and I always obey orders.
The vote by this group here will resemble a sketch of the one to come, although curiously, Doc Boone's reminder of ladies first points Curly to Dallas before Mallory.
Yes, courage, courage, Reverend. Ladies first.
Wounded, the outcast sounds coarse in asserting she will not stay where she is unwanted.
They got me in here, and I'll let them try to put me out. Worse things than Apaches.
A prim Mallory will also be unwavering.
My husband is with his troops in Dry Fork. If he's in danger, I want to be with him.
If we were privy to the fact of Mallory's pregnancy, would that influence our view of the imperious woman? In any case, the film and she successfully suppressed that knowledge until Apache Wells. References planted suggesting she is sick and should be traveling with a doctor do not register. Nor does it strike us that her determination to reunite with her husband may be unusually urgent. In addition, the gambler's last-minute gallantry in coming forth increases the mystery of their relationship and nicely diverts attention from questions of health.
Get going, Buck. Oh, Bessie, Brownie, Bill!
Stagecoach is famous for helping to revive the Western and introducing John Wayne and Monument Valley, the B-movie star and the remote Navajo reservation. But here I want to explore other major accomplishments. Ford's passion for the project was understandable. It offered him the ideal framework for developing key personal themes: the heroism of society's black sheep and underdogs, the impaired vision and social blindness that plague humanity, the necessity of sacrifice and redemption. The addition of Gatewood and the Ringo Kid would complete the passenger list for a collection of characters high and low, driven by their own demons, whose pilgrimage will be one to a painful discovery of self. Ford's achievement would be a film that is absolutely indispensable as the definitive statement of his and America's bedrock ideology, the formation of national character in the encounter with this great land, with the tests challenges, and adversity of a wilderness both savage and sublime. Ford was a great teacher. Dramatizing the sagas of the American past, he described the life of common folk as well as the powerful. He had already addressed the passing of the stagecoach in the Iron Horse of 1924, his account of the building of the transcontinental railway system. And before the stagecoach, there was the covered wagon that would star in 1950's Wagon Master, a personal favorite that would spawn Wagon Train, a primetime TV series that ran for 8 years. By definition, Americans are immigrants and nomads. Nothing shows Ford's understanding of both national character and his audience more than this sustained focus on frontier travel. And of course, behind it also was Ford's love of filming movement. A great success in the face of industry skepticism, Stagecoach was a tribute to the rugged, handsome, intricately designed, handmade vehicle that had been instrumental in maintaining the network of isolated frontier towns. Carrying mail, money, and passengers, it provided a commercial lifeline in the development of the West, by the 1860s ranging over 3,000 miles from Texas to the Dakotas and Missouri to California. The top of the line was the handsome Concorde that Buck drives, so named for the location of the New Hampshire company that produced them. Ford would bring back the stagecoach for a bow in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance as an icon of the frontier era.
He's jumped the reservation. Down the wall path.
The original story by Ernest Haycox had Ringo a passenger from the outset, but Ford and Nichols had moved his arrival into the desert. He is thus from the get-go the Western hero, he who embodies the knowledge and skills of the wilderness. The twirling rifle will be a particularly brilliant touch. As Robert Warshaw pointed out in his classic account of the Westerner as tragic hero, what distinguishes the character is that he kills. Although the violence is sanctioned where the law is weak, the hero is darkened as a result. This mix underlies the good-bad hero, the prototype for Ringo's revenge-driven outlaw. One of Ford's first mentors, Harry Carey, had explored the type in a series of 16 silent Ford-directed shorts. The black sheep hero would persist throughout Ford's work and is an important key to his themes. Ford insisted that Wayne study Carey in shaping his performance of Ringo. A friend and advisor to Wayne for years who had him wait for a role in a Ford film until he paid his dues in B-movies, Ford now gave him a commanding entrance. The rapid dolly in, at the cost of the startling loss of focus, was a radical flourish for Ford, given his normal stationary camera and his avoidance of close-ups.
Hold it!
Whoa, steady, ho, ho. Hey, look, it's Ringo.
Yeah.
But if the splashy entrance defines Wayne as the classic hero, it doesn't follow that Wayne is the film's hero. Too much has been made of his role. It is perhaps impossible for many pundits to recapture the film's original impact, given Wayne's mega-stardom and key roles in later Ford epics. More than one account dubs him the film's center. He is said to save the group in the battle with the Apache. It is seen as significant that his story extends beyond the journey and comprises the climax at the film's finale. But Stagecoach is, above all, an ensemble piece staffed with an outstanding collection of veteran character actors. In contrast, Wayne had one feature behind him, his starring debut in Raoul Walsh's The Big Trail of 1930 that had flopped, resulting in his long banishment to the B-movie wilderness. Wayne does not carry this film. To see Stagecoach thus is to ignore the pleasure of the complex interplay of its characters. Ringo himself, as the self-reliant cowboy, contributes to this, soon aligning himself with both Dallas and Doc and standing up to Hatfield and Gatewood, but giving him too much prominence is untrue to the film's collectivist tone and structure.
You're just smarter than a trade rat. You knew all the time he was going to Lordsburg.
The pattern Ford follows throughout the journey, organizing the narrative, involves cutting from Buck and Curly above to scenes within, and then to the landscape outside. Once Ringo has entered, this pattern is decisively established, repeated twice in a key sequence culminating in the coach's arrival at Dry Fork. Inside the stage, differences breed division and conflict among the passengers. Ford characters are often self-centered, their interests preventing them from honoring others' humanity. Separated by class, geography, morals, manners, and allegiances, they are akin to a rabble. Cutting away from the divisive squabbles inside the stage, Ford shows us what these immigrants are up against in a dominating image of Monument Valley's magnificent landscape. Ford positions the stage laboring up a grade in the foreground against the huge ancient rock formations that thrust skyward beyond. What is the impact of this and the even more daunting shot that follows that testify to Ford's pictorial genius? Do we see how puny man's efforts are against these timeless cathedrals? There is something of that here, perhaps, but the vast land and the enormity of its challenge can also be seen as ennobling. Touring the country in the 1830s with Alexis de Tocqueville, French magistrate and author Gustave de Beaumont observed in his novel Marie, the American remains unshaken by any misfortune. The most unexpected blow, the most imminent peril, find him impassive. Nothing stops him in his undertakings. Nothing discourages his efforts. He will never say, "I cannot." Bold, patient, indefatigable, he tries again. This people is steadfastly faithful to its origins, for it was born of exiles, and men who will travel 3,000 miles across the sea in search of a new fatherland must have a fund of energy in their souls. And it is an uplifting spirit that drives Stagecoach, transforming its pilgrims in their encounter with the New World. It is the American dream, the promise of reinvention and redemption that the film sings of. If it would dim in later work, Ford's passionate faith in America's manifest destiny in this early work is palpable. Haven't I any right to live? Dallas's cry would have resonated with the film's audiences. How many of them had encountered the foul disease of social prejudice? As a first-generation Irish-American, Ford certainly had. In the 19th century, millions of Irish arrived to fill menial jobs and be slandered as unclean by the English who had preceded them. No Irish need apply. Millions from Southern and Eastern Europe at the turn of the century ran the same gauntlet as do immigrants in our time. Ford was the American popular artist par excellence. Drawing on his own experience, he spoke to millions of émigrés and their offspring. What makes a man to wander? What makes a man to roam? The refrain from The Searchers is apropos. Although the Western was far from the world of new Americans, the perilous journeys Ford's characters made connected to the emotional experience of many in his audience. Leaning against a hitching post, Dallas is uncaring of the arguments swirling around her. What marks her off is that she is without hope. She has made her way through the touch of men. Dallas is a soiled dove, and her views have no worth. Ford punctuates the irony by having Buck and Gatewood command the discussion with their windy claims and threats.
Temper. I'll tell you how we settle it. We'll take a vote. Inside, everybody.
During the vote, she will be equally uninvolved, seeking the group's fringe. Running the meeting, Curly will have his back to her. Ringo will arrive in time to flush her out and shock the party. Instinctively courteous, as opposed to Hatfield's class-based, narcissistic nobleman, he will be unknowingly raising the question of what constitutes a lady. Do we find the highborn Mallory's insistence off-putting? Today's audiences, revisiting the film, know her condition, yet remarkably, her tone may still earn her little sympathy.
I'm determined to get to my husband. I won't be separated any longer.
Asked which directors he admired, Orson Welles replied, the old masters, John Ford, and John Ford. Ford was my teacher and Stagecoach my textbook. I ran it over 40 times. The proof is visible in the interiors. The style credited to Welles and cameraman Greg Toland of low angles and ceilings on sets in Citizen Kane was already in Stagecoach, as here.
What do you say, Hatfield?
Lordsburg.
I like the comic contrast here of Hatfield's self-conscious one-word vote with the theatrical filibuster of the drunken Boone.
Somewhere, sometime, there may be the right bullet.
In passing, we take note of Doc's companion, the also soused station master, Billy Pickett, played by Francis Ford. 12 years older than John, Francis was a top director and star when his sibling followed him to Hollywood to sit at his feet for 3 years of mentoring. But although the elder's career would collapse in the sound era, early resentments evidently were never forgotten. Ford employed Francis only in non-speaking cameos as a half-cracked child of nature or holy fool. A father 5 times over, Peacock's effeminate nature and domesticated status made him a sitting duck for Ford's often broad humor.
Brother, I think it best we go back with the bosoms. I mean, the soldiers.
Some critics wince at more extreme Fordian clowning, but he took comedy seriously as essential balance to the drama. Thus, Peacock's Freudian slip is followed by Ringo's seating of Dallas next to Mallory, who will be miffed. The whore's taking the liberty of sitting opposite her will cause pregnant glances between them and a naked, if genteel, violence from the soldier's wife.
You ain't drinking, Billy.
Sit down here, ma'am.
Mallory's cool gaze is brutal, a silent insult, capped by the annoyed dismissal of the hussy with a haughty blink and turn away. Bereft of self-esteem by her harsh judgment on herself, Dallas looks back and then down, the passive victim. These glances are not the flamboyant combat of women adversaries subverting the genre's masculine codes, as in Nicholas Ray's Johnny Guitar. Yet this silent confrontation nevertheless initiates a struggle that is at the heart of the film, a test of humanity and etiquette that Dallas will win. The crux will be Dallas's midwifery to the birth of Mallory's baby, and the result Dallas's salvation and rebirth at the price of Mallory's shame. It is Dallas who will supply the film's center of gravity. Typical is Ford's care in setting a table that shows civilizing graces operate on the savage frontier. On the other hand, savagery has invaded the dining room itself with the snub of segregation. Ringo unknowingly shoulders this transparent cruelty aimed at the whore. Thus, both have been wounded and their alliance reinforced. But in a deliberate move, Ford cuts to a long shot on the table from which he slowly dollies pointedly past them to frame the aristocratic couple as the haunting genie with the light brown hair plays, and they look back to a vanished South. Ford's democratizing instincts do not work only to bind us to the underdogs or level the high. Full of themselves a moment ago, the couple now appears bereft. Lucy is suddenly girlish, vulnerable. Hatfield seems beyond redemption. A mysterious disgrace haunts him. As Ringo will say, things happen, a fitting slogan for all four. Stagecoach had been a hard sell. It would take a year for Ford to find financing from Walter Wanger, a producer known for independence and quality projects after striking out at all the studios. And Ford had to fight for his cast. Everyone wanted Gary Cooper and Marlene Dietrich. But Ford had in mind a younger pair who could pass for ordinary people, unheroic. Trevor was established, but not a major player. Wayne was a B movie star. Both were poised for upgrades. They were right for a film whose action was one of becoming. Haycox's story from Collier's magazine, Stage to Lordsburg, contained prototypes for 5 of the passengers: Dallas, Ringo, Mallory, Hatfield, and Peacock. Doc Boone and Gatewood would replace 2 others, a cattleman and an Englishman. The structure leading up to the 2 action climaxes, the attack and the gunfight, was in place. Ford must have been pleased to see his typical design, the violence off stage, with the focus on the character most affected by the outcome. But neither story nor script is the source for this lovely scene of the coach and cavalry parting ways. Critics searching for significance often ignored this kind of fresh moment in its day. No real narrative content, right? Only a director schooled in the silent era could brighten the fateful departure of the troops with such expressive details. The roads diverging, Holt's smile, the cavalry wife's wave, the buttes on the horizon, the underlying sadness. It is pure Ford. Just 7 days of a 47-workday schedule were spent at Monument Valley in Utah and 2 at Dry Lake in California's Mojave for the Indian attack. A tight $546,000 budget meant filming on Republic's Western Street and on Goldwyn rear projection sets, whose unstable horizon lines now jar. Ford was getting a below-norm $50,000, but with a percentage. Nichols $20,000, Trevor, whose stock had risen with Dead End, $15,000. Wayne got just $3,700, B-movie pay. Mitchell's meaty role earned $12,000, and Devine's comedy $10,600. Platt and Bancroft were in the $8,000 range, Meek and Holt $5,000. Churchill at $4,500, and Carradine, rock bottom, at $3,666. The film was previewed in February, a month before its release, and a song was cut, 10,000 Cattle Gone Astray, which Ford would use in My Darling Clementine. Glowing reviews were matched by box office success, the film earning over $1 million by the end of 1939. Upstairs, we have a sustained 2-shot, appropriate for this affectionate pair, even though they often talk to themselves rather than each other. Ford's comic spin on the motif of the inwardness that typically blinds his characters. In contrast, we notice how Ford uses cutting and framing within the coach to isolate pairs and build action. In a 68-second scene, 9 shots remove Ringo and Hatfield and isolate Boone and Peacock doing Laurel and Hardy, with Boone wiping Peacock's prominent nose and attending to his deer stalker, shades of Sherlock of all people, as Dallas repairs her hat and the self-important but totally ignored banker agitates, complaining about the government's nosiness.
I have a slogan that should be blazoned on every newspaper in the country.
The cutting then focuses on poor Mallory, trapped between the hot air of the banker and the cold winds outside. Where is her conscientious guardian? This buoyant scene celebrates discord and communication failures, building a counterpoint between two mismatched couples, bombast and boredom on one side, and the tongue-tied and the tippler on the other, with a rhyming nod to hats and noses and the weather inside and out, and the coach rolls merrily on. Curiously, the very strangeness of Monument Valley's distinctive landscape persuades us of the authenticity of the film's West, combining with the effect of the score's familiar melodies and folk songs. A strong sense of American character colors the film's world. The colder climate of a mountain route, the altered script's explanation for a sudden snowfall, seems apt for Mallory's delivery of another icy snub to Dallas.
Maybe you'd like to sit next to me. You could put your head on my shoulder. No, thank you.
Dallas is crushed, turning her head as if slapped. Ford's achievement in Stagecoach was to renew the genre. The cavalry rescue, the gunfight, the happy ending, all would benefit from distinctive twists. Water provided another focus.
Ivar, canteen, please.
Lots of hot water, Dallas will call in the classic code for childbirth. As both birth and bath scenes in the genre testify, water serves useful purifying or civilizing functions. In Three Godfathers, Ford will have three villains rationing it, like a sacrament, to nourish the Christ child found in the desert. But here, the failing Mallory's thirsts will trigger another divisive class-conscious moment with the appearance of the silver cup that Hatfield disavows as his family's. We don't believe him.
Haven't I seen this crest before?
A writer can describe characters with precision, sharing their thoughts with us, but film images are ambiguous and can depend on context. Ford's style is an observational one that often walks a fine line between identification and detachment and leaves judgment open for us. Ford scholar Tag Gallagher has described it as one of empathic distance. In Stagecoach, Ford dramatized the challenge we face of seeing and understanding others by the extreme circumstances of a dangerous journey with strangers in a forced intimacy. In a series of encounters, the act of looking becomes charged with repressed feelings and questions. Mallory staring at Hatfield from the coach before it leaves, her cold inspection of Dallas at lunch, and later when Dallas braids her hair. In a different key will be Dallas's gaze at Ringo in the scene Coming, and Ringo's look at her in the film's Epiphany when she holds the baby. The elemental landscape and archetypal canvas may suggest myth, but the film's characterization of complex individuals facing existential tests humanizes and modernizes them. Is it all in the eyes, as Ford would say? Dallas's look at Ringo is just this side of troubled. 16, when he went to prison, Ringo is inexperienced, a lug without radar, innocent of her anguish. The forbidding landscape, the cold and wind, the wee hours stress their extreme situation. The urgency is heightened by the film's classical unities, the strong linear action, mainly concentrated in a single place in continuous brief time. What is Mallory thinking of? Her husband? Her baby? Do we identify with her and speculate? Expanding a short story, where Ford often found his narrative sources, he breathed new life into old conventions with his unflinching gaze. Is Peacock terrified of life because of his physical frailty? What failure has driven the brilliant doctor to such a shameful state? If Ford's theme was the powerless shall inherit the earth, by God, they would be powerless. The film was the first adult Western, as Ford liked to think of it, for its flawed characters. But although he exposes their failings, he allows us the freedom not to judge. A good thing, too, for the drunk and the coward have tests coming, which they will pass. The arrival of the coach at Apache Wells has Ford repeating favorite designs, shooting through the dark frame of the gate to the sunlit trail and rocks beyond, and holding on the coach until it comes through, one of the small visual pleasures his films routinely provide. Another is the side shot of the stationary coach that allows us to scan the all-important vehicle. Ford has been seen as guilty of racism in his treatment of some of the characters here, but the wall-eyed Mexican station master Chris, played by Chris Pin Martin, is seen with humor and affection. His tact and sensitivity in answering the questions of a concerned soldier's wife is perfect.
Did he go with his men?
Si, señora.
Gently ascertaining who she is and getting to the point succinctly.
Soldiers take Captain Morales to Lawrenceburg. I think he get hurt, maybe.
Badly?
Si, señora. I think so.
In contrast to the simple peasant's compassion, Mallory's dismissal of Dallas and her second offer of assistance seems even ruder than usual.
Mrs. Mallory, I'm awfully sorry. If there's anything I can... Quite all right, thank you.
There was no baby in the story. Instead, Haycox had the whiskey drummer, nursed by the prostitute before dying. The baby has been seen as Ford's strategy to broaden the appeal of the film beyond the genre's masculine orientation. In his essential study of the film, Edward Buscombe reproduces ads relating Claire Trevor's hairstyle to contemporary fashion. And the success of Ford's efforts to distinguish the film from lowbrow horse opera was clear in reviews that labeled it a melodrama. But for Ford, the family was virtually sacred. Asked why families were prominent in his films, Ford had roared, "Don't you have a mother?" In Stagecoach, the family can be seen as a structuring absence. The loss of family had driven Dallas to the wall and Ringo to his violent goal. The others can also be seen as suffering from family issues. In Peacock's case, perhaps too much of a good thing. But this lack the film will fill, both dramatically and spiritually. Ford's vision of the West was both epic and domestic. I once asked him what drew him to The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance's story. I liked it, he had replied. Two people, simple people, in a kitchen. The baby's birth is the crucial turning point. The headstrong young Mallory, Louise Platt was 24, has been impetuously pursuing the will-o'-the-wisp of being with her husband when her time comes. With her fall to the floor, that mirage disappears, and other illusions will be challenged, that by virtue of her class and temperament, she can control events, that she can imperil herself and her child without regard for fellow travelers, that she is above and does not need lesser mortals. The film interweaves this class warfare with the emergence of Dallas and Ringo's love and the threat of real war with Geronimo. However, Apache Wells provides the site and marks the moment when fortunes shift. Until now, the behavior and views of the privileged have dominated. But with the birth of the baby, Ford's social engineering kicks in and democratization rules. Now the outcasts and despised, Doc, Dallas, Peacock, and Ringo too, will act and set the tone. French film theorist André Bazin had greeted the film as the ultimate classical Western, perfectly balanced like a wheel, presumably a stagecoach's, with each spoke satisfying one of the genre's components. The elegance of this argument was a fitting one for a film so skillful in bringing its social and psychological matters to a head, precisely as the issues in its romance and action themes also begin to heat up. Ford had hit his stride with Stagecoach. His intention had been to elevate the Western genre, essential for the success of the film. Succeeding, he had also elevated his own status. In the 6 years since The Informer, he had made 8 films, none of them deeply involving or breakthroughs. But in Lindsay Anderson's phrase, he would achieve a rediscovery of America with the great populist quartet he was inaugurating with Stagecoach, followed by Young Mr. Lincoln, Drums Along the Mohawk, and The Grapes of Wrath, all finished, remarkably, within a year. With a painter's instincts, Ford was sensitive to the effect of silence and a composed stillness. His portrait of an excluded frontier manhood is suggestive. Are they worried, curious, respectful, all of the above? This group stands in for an absent father, but it also forestalls possible questions. Hatfield's nod to Curly when she had fainted had implied her time has come. But how had he known? It is surely indelicate to wonder if her water has broken. But no screaming Hollywood childbirth is this. Mallory is never heard from once she is abed. Moreover, any heroism attendant on the birth attaches to Boone's efforts rather than the mother's. Ford's ingenious design now inserts an entertainment by Mexican actress and singer Elvira Rios that neatly sidetracks us from Mallory's silent labors and offers a useful pause to mark the film's approaching halfway point. Although her appearance suggests a mixed heritage, Yakima, evidently so named as a joke on the film's stuntman, Yakima Canutt, is an Apache. Song is often the voice of community, but this Spanish lament for a homeland and lover is Yakima's own diversion, during which she orders the troops to leave. Yakima thus provides a typically complex example of race in Ford. If she gives authentic voice to the West's Hispanic culture, in short order, her disappearance, together with that of the vaqueros and the party's spare horses, will confirm Peacock's comical identification of her as savage, if you will. In the same way, Ford would again give Andy Devine a Mexican wife and brood of kids in both Two Rode Together and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Was this repeating a joke on stereotypes of Mexican family size, or evidence of Ford's consistent interest in ethnicity long before it became fashionable? In a letter to Lindsay Anderson, an English film critic before he turned to directing, who kept Ford's reputation alive virtually single-handedly during the 1950s, Dudley Nichols had remarked on what he thought the director's weakness, his inability to represent passionate love in women. Ford's feisty maidens or tough matriarchs were never eroticized. Here, what convinces Ringo Dallas is the gal for him is her transformation from harlot, the Mary Magdalene, to a Madonna-like mother-to-be. By suppressing the pregnancy and labor and denying maternal instincts or visual associations with the child to Mallory, the birth appears miraculous, immaculate. Yet it is also Dallas who delivers the baby. She is cleansed, redeemed, saved. Ringo sees her goodness. The whole film pivots on this moment.
It's a little girl.
It's a little girl.
As Louise Platt had suggested about Trevor's performance here, you just knew she would be a great mother. For Ford and Ringo, too, romantic love appears chaste, maternal. This holy event provides a blessed moment of grace that the couple shares with a prolonged, soulful gaze. Is it a stretch to suggest that spiritually they are America's founding family? Haycox's story had described its hero watching the woman pass down the narrow corridor to her own quarters. With his sharp eye, Ford had lifted the moment and framed it with a chiaroscuro image. Ford liked the shot and would repeat it in My Darling Clementine. And 27 years later, a similar moment achieves great poignancy at the end of Ford's last film, 1966's Seven Women, where Anne Bancroft goes to her death having agreed to prostitute herself with a grotesque Mongol chieftain in exchange for the freedom of women missionaries in China. Harking back to Stagecoach, such a moment testifies to the long line of Ford's creativity and vision. Despite his praise for Stagecoach, André Bazin argued the deep, focused, long-take style of Citizen Kane and William Wyler's The Best Years of Our Lives was more realistic and less manipulative than the classical editing of Ford. But as moments in Stagecoach like this corridor scene attest, Ford's flexible style accommodated both approaches. I also think manipulative hardly describes Ford's democratic vision. Ford's cameramen were typically in awe of his pictorial instincts, acknowledging he was his own best cameraman. As with writers, he gravitated to seasoned collaborators like Burt Glennon, cameraman on some 8 Fords, whose atmospheric, nocturnal images of Ringo following Dallas here hint at the emotional action developing between the couple that looks forward to their final walk in Lordsburg's darkness. Wayne's acting skills at this point in his career were still developing. Ford worked consistently, and by some accounts cruelly, to strip away bad B-movie habits and teach Wayne how to use his face and movements expressively. Sergio Leone had alienated Clint Eastwood when he began to describe how, like Michelangelo and his David, he had sculpted the man with no name out of the block of granite that Clint presented.
Maybe I can find work.
Such comes to mind at accounts of how Ford hammered away at Wayne, as with Trevor's memory of a test he made of the actor with her. At one point, Ford took Duke by the chin and shook him. "What are you doing with your mouth? Don't you know that you don't act with your mouth in the pictures? You act with your eyes." It was tough for Duke to take, but he took it and learned 8 volumes about acting in this picture, unquote. A recent analysis of the film claims that whenever Dallas speaks, we hear self-pity.
Well, you gotta live no matter what happens.
But if so, it is because she has internalized the mean judgments and contempt of society. Victimized by those who look down on the damaged, Dallas no longer sees her personhood as of value. Trevor had eagerly anticipated this first romantic exchange that was scripted to go beyond glances. But when it came, Ford cut all but 2 of her lines and played the moment off her eyes.
Nice place. A real nice place. Trees, grass, water. There's a cabin half built.
In shock, Dallas will blurt, "But you don't know me." But does Dallas know herself?
There you go.
But you don't know me. You don't know who I am.
It is this inability to see, both oneself and others, that Ford consistently employed as a basic character structure. In 1948's Ford Apache, it will be Henry Fonda's Custer figure that has both an elitist and Eurocentric gaze, dismissive of the Apache as subhuman. Of course, Ford did not always escape the mindsets of his time. In this early work, he himself is guilty of depersonalization of the Native Americans into a mythic force. We move from 2 souls who aspire to beat as one to individuals whose pursuit of different goals makes hearing others difficult. Ford immediately demonstrates with a comic confusion that breaks out over the subject of Chris's grief, loss of wife or horse, and the question of their relative value. The theme is also in suggestive details, like the 3 valises, each of whose contents also illustrate different life choices: money, liquor, and medicine, the provinces of corrupt, lost, and heroic souls, however damaged, respectively. An analysis of gender, class, and power has argued that all the passengers except Ringo are feminized, that the feminine is seen as weakness, and that the social order in Stagecoach is only restored through the masculine power of Ringo. Such an analysis seems blind to the fact that Ringo, ripe for domesticity, has his own feminized aspect, but more crucially, it ignores the emergence of a collective heroism. If Ford's egalitarian spirit could recognize a redeeming vulnerability in the privileged, above all, he saw the human potential and inherent nobility in the deprived and damaged. His films speak of the intrinsic worth of the ordinary person, the underdog, who in a magical moment may transcend weakness, but more typically must live with it. The film still speaks to us because we, too, are mere mortals with our own scars, regrets, and hopes of redemption. Ford surely had his. Silent Mallory's gaze at Dallas braiding her hair like an older sister is typically impassive. Can you look down on someone you're looking up at? Or is Mallory struggling to see Dallas outside the box of her class? Yet she seems ungracious. Dallas is still ignored, rudely referred to as she, in Mallory's report of her vigil to Boone, who seems amused by the pair.
She didn't go to bed, Doctor.
Wrapping her shawl tightly, Dallas protects her feelings against this left-handed praise. Their night together has been a night apart. A careless commentary suggests that Boone will recklessly confront Luke Plummer over the shotgun because he has nothing to lose but an empty life. This ignores the redemptive action of the film. Reborn a doctor who will also survive the Apache, he will not be the same drunk, nor will he be drunk when he steps up. Trevor was perfect for Dallas. 2 years earlier, she had been nominated for an Oscar for her young girl forced into prostitution in Dead End. She enjoyed great chemistry with Ford. He was inarticulate, but had a kind of radar, so that it all became clear. Such empathy testified to a feminine side in the same director who had praised Wayne in the past as one who moved like a dancer, but on Stagecoach would critique him for skipping like a goddamn fairy. Ironically, some accounts have Wayne modeling his walk on Ford's own. Unraveling these contradictions, as Joseph McBride has in his definitive study, Searching for John Ford, we may arrive at a man who aspired to the macho grit of his film's heroes by masking his finer nature. Trevor had met an enthusiastic Ford while he was editing. "It's going to be great, and you're so good they're not even going to notice. It'll go right over their heads." She regretted he was right. The progress she makes from a brassy defiance to a bitter despair to a hopeful sweetness, too subtle. She would have to wait for her humiliated gangster's maul in Key Largo for a role that commanded more attention. But to overlook her centrality in Stagecoach's scheme is a mistake. The unloved pariah, she carries much of the dramatic weight, her tense relationships with Mallory and Ringo structuring much of the action. As a cowboy, Wayne is a crucial part of the mix, but absent the touch of a Dallas, he will become the ethically blind and self-important hero, the toughest man west of the picket wire, of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, study of which, as a bookend to Stagecoach, is illuminating. To see Wayne as the epicenter, the motivating force, whose revenge provides the spine of the film, as another study argues, in my view, is to buy into our contemporary cult of celebrity worship. It suggests an inability to set aside the remarkable body of later collaborations in which Ford created Wayne as his hero and spokesman, and to see the film in its own time. A key poster produced for Stagecoach featured a shot of the group, all 9 principals. Reviews in both the national press and the trades singled out the ensemble, the script, direction, or cinematography. Wayne, welcomed back in a notice or two, came in for no special attention. In the New York Times, Franklin Nugent singled out Meek and Mitchell, showing the sensitivity to Ford's values that would equip him to replace Nichols as Ford's screenwriter for the later films. Nugent sensed Boone was Ford's surrogate, the drunken source of wit, speechifying, and authority. Saved from the abyss, he was the midwife to the birth of a new America, helping the whore, cold-cocking the capitalist, and ministering to the meek. Peacock was the anti-Ringo, so lacking in personal force, he cannot impose his name, occupation, or home. He is thoroughly human in his fear. If we cannot forgive him, whom can we forgive? The two actors would also have been favorites of Ford's for their importance in the film's comedy, as with Divine. Returning to the genre after 13 years, Ford brought a fresh eye. The result, a film hailed as the acme of the classical Western, and yet the first modern Western, too. A model consolidating the basic conventions, but also a breakthrough. A neat trick, its secret was endowing archetypes with depth, color, and variety, and fine-tuning traditional conventions. This scene is another example, the classic one in which the hero is asked by the woman who offers love and a settled life to refrain from violence.
It was 3 against 1 when the plumber swore that you killed their foreman. Got just sent up.
But traditionally, the woman who cannot understand the hero's need to face his violent destiny is from the East, a Mallory type who is ignorant of frontier life. The saloon entertainer or prostitute is privy to and in fact lives that life. She has no illusions about love and has in fact a quasi-masculine independence, her fate often to stop a bullet to signal civilization's advance. Here too, Stagecoach upended the genre by assigning this role to Dallas. This deviation throws light on the film's much-discussed ending. In its classic form as national epic, the Western myth calls for the symbolic marriage of the Western hero, master of wilderness knowledge and skills, with the Eastern woman who brings law and civilized virtues to mark the promise of a future America. But Dallas is a Western woman, and civilization is not imminent within her. Ford knew that the couple represented a barren dead end and belonged in Mexico's frontier. The ending was also logical in gracefully delivering them from a town where an ex-whore and her husband might not have been happy. Ford thought Haycox's story owed its origins to Guy de Maupassant's Boule de Suif, which translates ball of fat, the nickname attached to the plump prostitute who saves her ungrateful fellow travelers by obliging a Prussian officer's lust. Some have doubted the connection, but both stories critique upper-class hypocrisy and structure the action around the tainted lady, unappreciated for heroic efforts by her betters. Dallas's story might be a stretch as a title for our larger narrative, but in my view would be true to its core. A playwright, Nichols had gotten on-the-job training on 1930s Men Without Women, the first of 12 Fords he contributed to until the relationship ended with 1947's The Fugitive. Thereafter, Nugent would take over the role for 11 of the later films. These are marked by Ford's mature, poetic style, whereas some of the Nichols scripted films, although not Stagecoach, leaned toward experiment with expressionism. Nichols once claimed that he wrote Stagecoach, consulting Ford before and after drafts. But Ford's method of script construction was to work closely in a series of exhaustive back-and-forth exchanges. Not a writer himself, Ford used them as sounding boards and sources from which he could generate and shape material. Nugent said the final product was always Ford's, never the scriptwriter's. Ford believed a filmmaker was like an architect, and that a film was built on the set. He loathed unnecessary exposition and dialogue, and was famous for ripping out pages of script and adapting action freely to locations. He also hated overscoring, but loved folk songs, listening to them while planning shots and having them played on the set. There were some 17 in Stagecoach's score. An early analysis by Joseph McBride and Michael Wilmington mocked the idea of the film as the kind of heavy symbolic drama favored by Nichols Ford had pulled off in The Informer. The Coach is America, a nation of exiles, riven with warring factions. The pregnant woman is liberty, the banker is the corrupt Republican establishment, the sheriff Roosevelt, the plumbers the Axis powers. If the film hardly invites such allegory, it was clearly in tune politically with a nation suffering from its economy's crash. But the Gatewood character, with his pro-business hypocrisy, does seem conceived at a different level.
You talk too much, Gatewood. Your threats don't faze me, Hatfield.
A calculated attempt to speak directly to an audience aware of the misdeeds of the era's banks. Was this Ford or Nichols talking? Although they shared liberal values, Nichols was more committed. Ford had barred him from a drinking club of buddies for being too liberal. The script added Doc Boone and the banker. The drunk, a holy fool, was pure Ford. But it may be the director had given Nichols his head in shaping Gatewood. Ford was fond of the saguaro cactus that, like Monument Valley, had become an icon of the West. As with the valley, their strangeness contributes to the curious effect of a world both familiar and fabled. The optimism of Buck and Curly as they approach their last stop will be punctured by Ford, who will cue us with smoke and the soundtrack's Indian chords before panning with the coach to discover the burning way station buildings. I find the elegance of such camera movement so organic and efficient, a constant source of pleasure in Ford.
Look at the ferry. It's where to?
Lee's ferry provides their darkest moment, the fires and destruction creating a hellish atmosphere.
What's the soldiers doing? What can I do? I'm going to let you run them and put them through the
Ringo loses the cuffs, but his hands remain tied,
I'll give you my word.
committing to the community over the personal. We suspect Hatfield, soon gallantly covering a woman victim of the Apache, kneeling as if in prayer, is moved less by common decency than the Southern gentleman's code of honor, a nobility sensitive to threats of violation by savages that will prompt him to try to execute Mallory. Ford's eye for locations is always sensitive to the drama inherent in landscape, as in the rocky texture of the terrain and the discovery of an Indian force on the distant ridge that is bearing on their course. Ever stalwart, Hatfield evidently will keep it to himself. The setback of the burnt-out ferry will be overcome by the ingenuity of Curly's solution, although in fact it is Yakima Knutz who had devised the undercarriage that tows the stage across. But if the success of the ferry crossing cheers the party, it is a false dawn, the classical attack of illusion before disaster strikes. Here fate awaits in the form of Apache we are about to discover above Monument Valley. As the coach descends into the stream to commence its crossing, if you keep your eye on the driver's back, the shadow of Glennon's camera as it pans will appear immediately after Curly throws a rock. Here, evidence of Ford's practical nature in tolerating gaffes. A dream landscape is how some have described Monument Valley, and there is an unearthly ambience there. When I once met Ford, I mentioned that I had visited both Ireland's Connemara, from whence his parents had emigrated, and the valley, and had been struck with how, despite glaring contrasts of green moors and red desert, a similar tone could be detected. Ford had nodded vigorously. Very like, he had said, very like. What I had in mind was an eerie, desolate quality, but Ford has described his favorite location as the most complete, beautiful, and peaceful place on Earth. In a film that has all the principles making theatrical entrances, Ford gave Geronimo the most dramatic, panning up from the valley's floor to the Apaches not once but twice. treatments of Native Americans as victims of racism would have to wait until the more complex narratives of later Ford. But although the Indians are never individualized or seen historically, Ford's setup gives them a commanding ownership of the land. They are not intruders. Although only a week with a troop of cavalry, a band of Indians, and doubles for the passengers was spent in the valley, its stunning exteriors had obviously sold Ford. Stagecoach was the first of a string of 7 major Western entertainments that would make the location Ford's personal signature, an icon of the West and of America. But Ford's appropriation of the site is also an accurate metaphor for American imperialism. The Western genre, and Ford's films in particular, repeat the original sin, the disenfranchising of Native Americans by stealing their land. The holy Navajo home becomes Ford country, whose conquest forms the character of America, white America. Ford could not have been unaware of the ironies involved. Film scholars have traveled to Russia to time how long it takes to run down the Odessa steppes, to compare with the most famous scene in film history, the massacre that features the time-expanding montage of Sergei Eisenstein in Battleship Potemkin. I doubt anyone has run the Dry Lake site, but Ford had stretched his attack to 7.5 minutes from the arrow's arrival. Conceived like Potemkin's as an essentially silent set piece, the chase's dynamism is a function of the movement in the frame, running horses again, and an increasingly faster editing pace. The average length of individual shots during the chase is 5 seconds, half the average for the rest of the film. Much commented on has been the freedom with which Ford violates the so-called 180-degree rule, which requires continuity of action be honored from shot to shot, whereas, as here, he reverses the direction in which the stage and riders are moving in successive shots. This freedom confirms Ford's preference for his vision over conventions, for poetry and myth over the real. At a second level, the practice shows Ford's faith in his ability to maintain action at an intensity that suspends disbelief. When critics would suggest all the Indians needed was to shoot a horse, Ford was again cavalier. There'd be no movie then, he'd point out. Wayne always looked good with a Winchester. Brilliantly, Ford had him debut twirling one and using it here and in the finale, where together with the dive to a prone position, it made plausible the dispatch of the 3 plumbers. Although there were films where he used the handgun, he looked complete, most himself, where he carried a rifle, as in Howard Hawks' Rio Bravo, where he explained he had found somewhere faster with a revolver. But the long gun agreed with his size and heft, and provided a symbol of authority and a handy club. Some moments appear rough 7 decades later, as with the marriage of location and studio material, or campy, as with riders falling in pairs. But the high energy and cracking pace still entertain, as do Yakima Canutt's stunts that crown both Ford's action and his own career. He had ended the scary moment of the coach passing over him by ad-libbing a half-rise and offered to repeat the stunt, but a shaken Ford would not hear of it. Famous for editing in the camera by shooting the minimum to prevent meddling, Ford, unusually for him, had 3 cameras covering this moment. Although a journey film through dangerous terrain with a revenge motif suggests a film of physical action, this was not how Stagecoach had developed. The conflicts in the coach and the close way stations gave the film the quality of a closet drama. The action had been interior, psychological. The Stagecoach had also been a theater stage, given the histrionics and self-dramatizing poses of many of the passengers. Both Ringo and Boone were key supporting players, But much of the action of Stagecoach thus far had been that of a woman's film, with Dallas and Mallory, its key players, its climax, the birth of a baby. The confinement of the characters, their struggles with each other back and forth, and the growing tension and fear hovering over the journey from the beginning explain why this sequence, a self-enclosed action film, is so liberating, an audacious, cathartic payoff to the film's deliberate and sustained build-up, and one of the keys to Stagecoach's triumph. In contrast to much of the first 70 minutes, the action here is outside and that of a male cosmos. Especially noteworthy is the uninhibited glee shared by Boone and Hatfield as they fire away. Meanwhile, Dallas shelters the baby and her weak sister prays. Ford had ridden for D.W. Griffith as one of the Klansmen in Birth of a Nation, and here quotes from his Battle of Elderbush Gulch of 1913, where Lillian Gish had also been threatened with death to save her from savages. Given the timing of Hatfield's death and the cavalry rescue, do we sense an obligatory intervention of the gods, or do we feel our passengers have earned their survival of this final obstacle? Sound allows Ford to improve on the Griffith original by insinuating the cavalry's arrival through oral cues discovered by the character in peril to goose the drama. We admire this invention, inviting us to work with Mallory to hear the bugle, and that has Hatfield expiring in a posture of morbid nobility, about to kill Mallory to save her. Better dead than bedded by red was a sentiment that would recur in Ford, reflective of the captivity narratives authored by early pioneers, and it's logical enough in a film where the faceless Indians are projections of white fear. For its recycling of Western archetypes and actors, the film has been seen as a compendium of the genre's history. Fair enough. But the point has evidently obscured the fact that aesthetically, Stagecoach is above all homage to the silent cinema. The wordless moments characters share, the set pieces like the opening and the Apache attack, and the Lordsburg sequences in toto, all testify that Ford was going home in more ways than one. The symphonic score that won composer Richard Hageman and his 4 co-authors the film's second Oscar will provide a crucial counterpoint to the action. But the final 18 minutes of the film will be free of lengthy exchanges or speeches and largely rely on single lines of dialogue. In transition, the emphasis on action continues with the multiple columns of 4 horsemen leaving the desert, dissolving into the parade of the 7th Cavalry down the main street of Lordsburg, crowded with rubberneckers. Ford pays tribute to the soldiers for their rescue and shows his trust in our curiosity by holding on the troops to allow us to register their look and movements. Stagecoach's dramatic action turns on the difference between looking and seeing. Like others of her class, Mallory knew that merely looking at another without speech or acknowledgement could be an exercise of power. But here she will be finally seeing Dallas, finally calling her by name. She is mortified, also seeing that she has been the uncivilized one. We have to feel sorry for the spiritually frigid woman, never shown with her child. She is coded as invalid rather than mother. She chokes out a half a line, an implied apology, before she realizes she is repeating Dallas's offer that she had cut off harshly.
If there's ever anything I can do for...
Dallas returns the cloak that had hidden Mallory's pregnancy that she has evidently worn to shelter the infant. It is the last link with her own desire. Dallas is at rock bottom. The baby she has been mothering gone, her dream for a future with Ringo in jeopardy. She marches off manfully, but is soon contemplating the emptiness her life now appears to offer as she absent-mindedly brushes her bonnet, the worse the wear for the journey. Ford always pays careful attention to hats in his westerns, as those worn by the colorful types that recognize Ringo here attest. Sergio Leone would be much praised for exploiting such iconic vultures 3 decades later.
It's the Ringo Kid.
Throughout, Ford has given new life to old forms by reversals, but here he plays the most venerable of the genre's conventions straight, although with the deliberate self-consciousness of a Leone or a Quentin Tarantino quoting who else but himself. And like a postmodern riff, it works at 2 levels. We are both involved by the building suspense and yet in admiration at the mastery of the artist reviving the ancient formula. Luke's is a final theatrical entrance, ripe for legend. The face in shadows, aces and eights, the dead man's hand. This scene runs on a minute in silence, broken only by chords repeated over and over by the saloon's placid piano player, evidently a fatalist. Ritual is being observed. Everything seems in slow motion. Veteran Tom Tyler, menace incarnate as Luke, looking like the black hat baddie he had played in silent westerns, intimidates the room. Death is in the air. We understand it has all happened many times before and must be played out again. It is silent cinema in the sound era, but it is the movies, the right term for Ford's work, because as Nugent said of them, they are moving pictures. The piano player seems aware he is supplying a soundtrack to history, myth, or both. The music carries us out to an oblivious Dallas, and now there will be another line of dialogue, a generous invitation, and finally, an articulate and complete sentence from Peacock.
That's right. Goodbye, Miss Dallas. If you ever come to Kansas City, Kansas, I want you to come out to see us.
Ford's commitment to the primacy of Dallas's point of view in the film's denouement is evident here as he stays with her for 15 seconds as she ambles on, impassive, a hint of fear in her eyes. Making each character confront their worst fears as purgatorial punishment, Ford and Nichols had had the frail Peacock, of all of them, wounded. But he survived it, finally calm. Now both she and Ringo must face their own moments of truth. Curly is a puzzle. His estimate of Ringo's prison time offers no hint of the possibility of his collusion in an escape.
Oh, about another year.
He apprehended the kid to protect him from the plumbers, yet now seems ready to let him leave with an empty rifle. Ringo's admission he had saved 3 bullets, seen by some as evidence of the primacy of his revenge over community, is confusing. When ammo had run out, he was already riding the lead horse, and the timeline suggests no occasion on which he could have lied to Curly. Relieving the solemn air, anticipating impending sad events, Gatewood's comeuppance is a loud, public, and comical affair. He is apprehended in character, pontificating. He has been the drama's vice, the morality play's comic fool, and the melodrama's scoundrel, whose ignominious exit we in the cheap seats can all applaud. Ford emphasizes the popularity of the event by having a crowd march off happily with the disgraced banker. Typical Ford, his comic exit is followed by the grim promenade of Dallas and Ringo. That walk and the gunfight's ritual march again will be silent passages, but for the bordello's tunes that color the couple's progress and the chords building to the climax of Ringo's action.
Lied to you, Curly.
Wayne was always to favor the distinctive paneled shirt prominent here that lends him a formal, quasi-military authority. There has been much attention given to the gunfight. Most accounts quote the character in Walker Percy's novel, The Moviegoer, who confesses he finds moments from bad movies more memorable than real life. Curiously, he then demonstrates by referring to Stagecoach's gunfight and the moment where the missing villain, Harry Lime, materializes in Carol Reed's The Third Man. Hardly bad movies. Also, pardon the heresy, but I think the gunfight is simply not as arresting as the magical appearance of Orson Welles with his suave, devilish smile to the tune of the mesmerizing zither. And we don't even see the action, Ford sticking to his guns, disinterested in the violence rather than its effects on people.
I gotta know where you live, don't I?
No, don't come any further.
Like a polite date, Ringo insists on walking the distraught Dallas to her door. When will the penny drop? I'm in the minority, but what I find most memorable is not Ringo's march to glory, but Dallas's walk through hell. After the purgatory of the abuse she has suffered and the terrifying Apache attack, now she must face her past, her own confrontation, far more agonizing, indeed unbearable, than Ringo's. Hatfield had said, "You wouldn't understand, cowboy. You've never seen an angel or a great lady." Hatfield had meant a refined woman of high social position. But it is Dallas who has emerged a great lady in a more modern sense, kind and considerate even in the face of contempt. She is the film's angel, its heart and soul, as she has been the focus of its class-conscious politics. The reluctant subject of municipal persecution, Dallas's presence had provided tests of charity for her more respectable companions. Twice she had reached out to Mallory, only to be slapped and turn the cheek. Underlying the parable of American democracy in Stagecoach is another. The lesson that its morality play teaches enacts the ancient biblical prophecy. Those who would exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who are humble will be exalted. Dallas has been a Christian soldier, marching on to the bitter and humiliating end. To posit Ringo's revenge as the spine of the film is to give Stagecoach a wrong-headed masculine bias it doesn't justify. In fact, Ford was feminizing and domesticating the West, a project he would continue in the great films that lay ahead. Dallas's walk through the dark world of her past, the woman numb, beyond despair, her eyes glistening, is one of the greatest moments in all of Ford. Unflinchingly, he records her ordeal. The sins of the soiled dove come home to roost. They pass a noir-lit tableau, a grim woman waiting, a mocking reflection of Dallas herself, and scenes and sounds of a sleazy, honky-tonk revelry. The silence between them stretches on. The director and his screenwriter had crowed, "There isn't a single respectable citizen in the bunch." Was Boone speaking for Ford in seeing the couple as saved the blessings of civilization? What is the film's attitude toward its pioneer world? Ford's master theme was grand, the building of the nation. But when asked by Peter Bogdanovich about the recurring motif of the glory and defeat, Ford had allowed that it fit. Simultaneously with the celebration of the great experiment of America, John Winthrop's City on a Hill, there is often mourning for the nation's decline. The Western myth is inherently two-faced. The East, the source of both enlightenment and corruption, the West, the home of both heroism and savagery. Each film can ring its own changes, bright or dark. In his career, Ford employed a double vision, a dream looking forward to greatness, and a nostalgic regret for past glory. Flowering in the late masterpiece, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, traces of this ambiguity and ambivalence are embodied in Tonto's society, ruled over by Gatewood and his wife's law and order posse. Their eviction of Dallas and Doc Boone smacks of the bigotry and persecution the earliest immigrants had fled from in Europe. Thus, the direction of the journey would seem westward ho, a movement toward a more open frontier and a rough and ready judgment day where, if debauchery prospers, action is possible that can heal wounds. Hence the purifying that has eliminated Hatfield, humbled Mallory and Gatewood, and is about to destroy the anarchic plumbers. But that Ford has it both ways is capped by his typical paradox at the end. The reborn couple, spiritually the Adam and Eve of the new America, finding no justice in the new world and allowed to escape to Mexico's wilderness. This duality accounts for different readings of the film. Ford scholar Tag Gallagher sees no community emerge, arguing we are left with the view that civilization is corrupting. Historian Richard Slotkin finds no progress in the journey from shrews to whores between two flawed communities, and the film a reworking of B-movie conventions rather than an epic. Such readings are provocative, but seem to me to depend on a rejection of the film's basic thrust. The reason Stagecoach was seen as the defining example of the Western was not because it enshrined genre archetypes and conventions, but because these were at the service of a national epic, a rehearsal of both Ford and America's dream of the West as a transformative experience. In Stagecoach, new citizens are forged in the fire of encounters with the wilderness, the coach a microcosm birthing the nucleus of an ideal egalitarian society. However, the finale tears the fabric, suggesting the West at an earlier moment, the historical process fragmented. It is Lucy Mallory, hopefully enlightened, who holds America's future, while its logical guardians leave the country. If such a resolution confounds expectations, it suited its director. Ford was a contrarian in his personality, his politics, and his art, a family man and yet a loner, beloved by his actors, whom he often bullied, a populist and a militarist. The endings of many of his films were perverse, turning back on themselves, providing a final surprise or adjustment. Nothing provided him greater pleasure than giving his critics and audiences pause, forcing a double take, as here, cutting away from the killing to the real action, to Dallas. But as with the birth of the little girl that is America's future, Ford's deepest values are never in doubt. He had agreed with the French critic Jean Mitry that a defining structure in his work was the test, a nucleus of humanity in peril, facing destiny. Such a crisis, in Ford's words, allows them to define themselves, to take stock of who they are, to shake off their indifference, inertia, conventions, their ordinariness. What Ford asked of his characters was that they travel a journey of self-discovery, growing to be able to see themselves and others clearly, without the screens and blindness of misperception and bias. And I believe this was the test he himself had faced in making the films he left behind. At his peak, which he was reaching with Stagecoach, he too had transcended conventions and ordinariness and ridden to glory. Of course, as with the representation of race, he had his blind spots too, although, as he often would point out, in his career, he had been on both sides of that issue. I have a personal story that may provide an apt coda for this meditation on Stagecoach. I made my obligatory pilgrimage to Monument Valley 5 or 6 years after Ford shot his last great Western there, 1964's Cheyenne Autumn, the 7th production Ford had brought to the Navajo reservation. I knew how proud Ford was of having been adopted by the tribe on his first visit to the valley with Stagecoach. He had been christened, if that word applies, Natanyinez, or tall soldier, although as a man of the sea, he would have preferred sailor, for which the Navajo had no word. He regularly answered charges of racism for using Navajos as all-tribe engines by pointing to the benefits to their economy his productions had provided. His concern for the Navajo was legendary, extending even to stories of parachute drops of supplies during a bleak winter. And so at the Valley's visitor center, I couldn't resist asking the young Navajo attendant, "Do you know who John Ford is?" He looked at me suspiciously, and after a beat said, "He invented the automobile, didn't he?" Well, sic transit gloria. I'd like to think the imperious Ford himself might have enjoyed this story, but I wouldn't bet on it.